little pixie warriors, and somehow I became the chieftain.
Yeah.
Anyway, hello everyone.
And there you were. All right. Hey, hi. Trying to make sure that I'm actually live. It does say we're live, so that's really good news considering how the post show went. So good evening, mediums. Welcome to another episode of Live here on Keystroke Medium. Tonight we have two fabulous guests, Chris Pourteau and David Bruns. Chris is the best-selling author of the sci-fi thriller novels of the SynCorp Saga, co-authored with David Bruns, B-Runs I like to call him, the post-apocalyptic Serenity Strain novels and the military sci-fi collection Tales of B Company. His first novel, Shadows Burned In, earned the 2015 eLit Book Awards Gold Medal for Literary Fiction. The Lazarus Protocol, the first novel in the SynCorp Saga, placed in the top 10 in the Read Freely's 2018 50 Best Indie Books of the Year contest. David is a former submarine officer who left the business world to write about sci-fi and spies. After meeting Tom Clancy and reading The Hunt for Red October as a midshipman in the Naval Academy, he spent 6 years as a commissioned officer in the nuclear-powered submarine force chasing the Russians in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. David co-authors novels in two different genres. With retired Naval Intel Officer J.R. Olson, he writes national security thrillers that look less like fiction to us every single day we check the news. Their latest novel, Rules of Engagement, comes out in June 2019. Tomorrow, maybe? Tomorrow comes out tomorrow, and that's with St. Martin's Press. So very cool there.
And he's sober.
And he's still sober right after the show is going, so I get prepped. Also with Chris, David writes sci-fi series, the SynCorp Saga, about the corporate takeover of the solar system, which seems like really the only good way to do it. Right?
Well, that's what we thought.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, it's excellent to have you here. Ralph and I we're gonna muddle through this. Josh is building a deck and something like that.
Is that what the kids are calling it now?
Yeah, that's what they call it. Hey, I'm gonna go.
Yeah. So Scott and I have to apologise in advance that you guys are going to have to slum it with us tonight.
Yeah, but, you guys are slumming. Yeah. We like to call it slumming with keystroke.
Slumming with keystroke. Maybe a new show.
It might be a spinoff. See, we got our own little niche now.
That's right.
So I know a lot of people that come watch, so they've probably seen both of you on the show before. But if Chris, you want to start off and tell us just a little bit about yourself and how you got started in writing, and then David can do the same, and we'll fill it out a little bit.
Sure. So I've been doing the indie writing thing since about 2013. I initially saw self-publishing as sort of the online electronic version of Vanity Press. And then I read several books: The Scourge by Roberta Colas, Breakers by Ed Robertson, and The Old Man of the Wasteland by Nick Cole. And all of those books, for one reason or other, blew me away. And they're all self-published books.
Excellent.
And I realized, wow, you can be self-published, and it's not Vanity Press. It's different, very different. So I published my first book in 2013. That was Shadows Burned In. And then sort of meandered around. By the way, this is the inverse marketing lesson for the day. Do not do this. Meandered around between apocalyptic fiction like zombie stuff, and then sort of dipped my toe into sci-fi, and I'm broadening that footprint a little bit in sci-fi now. But it's probably not a great idea if you're looking for a target audience to scattershot.
Right.
You kind of miss the bullseye there. So anyway, I've been doing that since about 2013. A couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, actually, I wrote a novel that has yet to come out, actually, called Optional Retirement Plan, but that's going to be coming out soon from Avon Books. The reason I bring that up is that I had sort of done like a 7-page little world document for the background for this character in this book. And when David and I were looking for something to write together, we didn't have any better ideas, so I said, well, why don't we flesh out this world behind this book that I have this little world on? And so we sort of took it from there, and David started with the first trilogy, and I'm finishing the second trilogy now.
Excellent. I'm putting the link in here in case Josh wants to try and join in. I think that he can. Oops, that's the wrong link. Oh, well. He'll figure it out.
I dread to think what link you've just provided there.
It's all right. He's probably seen it before. I'm just going to take a wild stab in the dark.
Sorry, Chris, can I just ask that you move your mic a little bit closer to your mouth? It's just a little faint.
How's that?
We don't want to miss any pearls.
Okay.
Good deal.
Okay. David, do you want to give us a little bit of a rundown on
so I
yourself?
started actually in the independent publishing scene right around the same time as Chris. I left the job and decided, it was in like April, and I decided I was not going to look for anything new until September. So I prior to that, I had a job where I literally traveled every week, and all of a sudden I was home every week, every day, all day. And my wife says to me, "You got to find something to do because you're driving me crazy." So I looked around. She says, "You know, you've always said you're going to write a book. Why don't you write a book?" I said, "That's a great idea." So next morning I started. I had like a chapter or something that I started of. So I had several half-finished novels, and started that. And I'm like, wow, I need an outline. And then I wrote a couple more chapters. I'm like, wow, I need a better outline. Finished the first book. Looked around and said, geez, you know, this independent publishing thing is really going on. I'm going to try that. So at the end of the summer, I published a book. Wasn't a very good book, but it was the first book. Published that, and I decided that was what I wasn't going to go back to another conventional job. I was going to keep doing that. So I wrote a science fiction series called The Dream Guild Chronicles. It was roughly based off of that first book. And about a year after I'd finished, I finished that over the course of a year and published it. And I was looking for the next thing to write. I kind of wanted to switch genres, and I ran into a friend of mine who had retired from the Navy and was a career intel officer. And we were speaking at a Naval Academy parents meeting, and somebody suggested we should get together and write a book. So I called him up the next week. I said, "What do you think about this book idea?" He says, "I think it's a great idea." He says, "I've got a perfect idea for a first book." So in 2015, we finally finished our first book together called Weapons of Mass Deception. We did one the next year called Jihadi Apprentice. Our third one, eventually, my partner, my other writing partner besides Chris, really wanted to try traditional publishing. So we found an agent, found a publisher. That's the one that comes out tomorrow. But in between all that, I was writing some short fiction, and I was working with Chris on a couple of projects. He and I got along together really well, and he had this idea for this, 9-book series, and he talked about sort of the World Bible, and he talked about this book that he had already written, and he really had sort of the center trilogy of those 9 books. It's 3 linked trilogies. The center trilogy of those 9 books. He sort of had it locked down in his head what he wanted. So I said, well, how about if I work on the first trilogy and I sort of flesh out the prequel? You can work on the second one, and then we'll figure out what the heck we do on the third one. So that first trilogy launched a little over a year ago. It was a year in September, and we published them in rapid succession, one a month: September, October, November in 2018. And then Chris started publishing the second trilogy of the SynCorp Saga in 2019. So it's been a really interesting ride. Collaborations are very different depending on the person. The way that Chris and I collaborate is very different than how I collaborate with my other writing partner. And we sort of have different goals too. I mean, my other writing partner really wanted to try traditional publishing. He eventually talked me into it. Chris and I have, stayed more the independent route.
That's really interesting. It very much sounds like kind of you're getting your cake and eating it a little bit. I don't mean that disparagingly, but sort of often the debate amongst indie authors, or authors generally, I should say, is whether we're going to go the indie route or whether we're going to go the trad route. And it sounds like you've managed to nail both, which is a fantastic skill set.
So this is actually, so I mean, it's funny you should say, because there is one thing about it. So we crowdfunded and published 2 novels, one a year, 2015, 2016. So we knew what we could do commercially with independent publishing. So when we actually went through the route and found an agent and sat down with the agent, we said, look, we're not interested in a small press because we're interested in a big advance, which means by definition a larger publisher, right? Because we know what we can do by ourselves, and we want to do better than that. So we want to, we want to have a nationwide launch for And to his credit, the agent was fine with that because it really gave him direction on what to look for. So I think in the end, he only stubbed to like 12 publishers. And we found that we got an answer within a couple of months. And I was perfectly fine with the answer being no. And because when we gave him the manuscript, it was 100% done. It had already been through our editor. And I mean, we were literally ready to publish it, just put a cover on it and publish it. So it wasn't like this was sort of something we were going to try. And if the answer was it didn't work out, hey, you know, it didn't work out. We tried, we swung, we missed, or, you know, it foul ball into the stands, whatever, and then you move on.
How'd you go about picking an agent or finding an agent?
So interesting. So what I would not recommend is blind querying.
Right.
Because I think it's just like telemarketing in reverse. We went to a pitch conference, which again, I was very reluctant to do because it cost a couple $100 and you get 10 minutes with an agent. To my surprise, that was actually pretty productive. We got 2 agents who were very interested out of that. We also went to people we already knew who had agents. Like Rhett Bruno was actually one of them. And another guy who writes submarine thrillers and coincidentally has the same agent we have today. And I mean, that process it took us like from the middle of April until basically the 1st of June. So like 6 weeks, which again is pretty quick, but we were pretty focused. We were like, you know, we're going to try this for 3 months. If it doesn't work, then we're just going to go and do our own thing because we already know how to do that. So what I would recommend to anyone is go to people who already have agents, who you trust and who write in the same genre, and ask to be referred to their agent, because then you get to the top of the email pile. It's a total mess out there. I mean, you know, there's agents who publish how many queries they get. And one I follow, her name is Kristen Nelson. This was a couple of years ago, but her agency got like, and she had, I don't know, 2 or 3 agents. She got like 35,000 queries in a year. And she accepted like, I don't know, 30 manuscripts or something. So, you know, think of the math and think of somebody going through all those emails. You know, how much time are they going to spend on a query? Seconds, literally seconds.
Yeah, you might just be luck of the draw. Like they say, you should never buy a car that was built on Monday or Friday because on Monday they're hungover, and Friday they're ready to get. Well, the same way with it. Your agent gets it on a Monday, like not feeling it.
Well, yeah,
there's a very interesting YouTube, isn't there, where an agent live streams a pile of submissions.
Oh God!
And oh yeah, it is. Oh God, this guy has a pile of submissions. He has a cover letter and he has the first paragraph, and he reads the cover letter. He doesn't even go through the whole one. It's like the first couple of lines, and he's like, no. First couple of lines got me. All right, okay, I'll read the first couple of lines of the manuscript. Nah, and that is how quick it is. So anything you can get or do to do an advantage. And I know for a friend of ours, they've accidentally done something or accidentally had something done for them, which meant that they got loads of submissions. So I was on holiday last week, and suddenly, we get one of our friends saying, "Can you help with a load of submissions?" And it was like that. I suddenly had 10 appear in my inbox, and I was like, "No. Yeah, okay, I'll move into that."
I can click the delete button 10 times.
Because we all know on this chat how much effort goes into that manuscript, and then to think that you've got some guy sat in a bar on the beach going, no.
Pretty much a guy sitting in a bar on a beach would probably be helpful for any submissions, I might say.
As we're going through the evening, it was getting easier or harder for some people, like depending on.
So you write your 100,000 word manuscript, and common practice on query letters is that they're 200 words, and so your entire plot should be no more than 50 words long. So, I mean, think about your manuscript could be, the best thing since ever written. But if your query letter is crap, it's not going to get touched.
Yeah.
Well, traditionally they call it an elevator pitch, and one of the reasons is because there was a certain publishing house where it was in an office block, and the publishing company was on the 4th floor, and the elevator pitch was sort of like the 15 seconds or whatever it took for the elevator to get from floor 0 to floor 4, and that's how the authors got in. Was sort of like they just muscled their way into the elevator. One of the editors was there, and they had that long to sell their book. It sounds brutal, but there has to be a gatekeeper on that kind of thing, doesn't there? And that is a very coarse but effective one.
William in the live chat mentions that it's not much different from writing an Amazon blurb. You have to be pretty concise. So we should talk about. So let's talk about your guys' collaboration with the SynCorp Saga, and maybe talk about. And maybe I mean, how did you guys come up with your blurb or your description for a sci-fi project like that? What was your process? I'd like to know, because I'd like to steal it and use it for myself.
Why don't you take it, Chris?
Well, like everything else about the first trilogy, and David has a great description. Collaborations are context work. In fact, the very first description for Lazarus Protocol, which is the first book in the series, I think I came up with the initial description, and then he took it and worked it over, and I can't remember the process, but man, we were going back and forth, and just like any a collaboration is like any dual relationship, marriage or whatever, man. You know, eventually you get on each other's nerves, and somebody slams the door, and then you walk away, and then you come back, and then you say, well, maybe this, and that's kind of how the first blurb was born. And I think actually since then, David has reworked it again. Which actually must have been pretty effective, because Amazon Prime emailed us about a couple weeks ago and said, "Hey, we want to put Lazarus Protocol on Amazon Prime." We were like,
"Well, congrats! That's good."
Sure. Yeah. Apparently they don't pay anymore. We missed that vote, but anyway, it's apparently getting some more eyes, because it's kind of moved after almost a year on Amazon. It's actually moved back up in the ratings, so that was helpful. And so that, of course, that's the entry point for all 6 novels, and so hopefully. We've had really good read-through. What's the percentage on the read-through, David?
Yeah, I mean, so we don't have read-through numbers for books 1 through 5. We have read-through numbers on books 1 through 3, because for 4 and 5, which is the second trilogy, have only the numbers haven't really stabilized yet. But I mean, read-through on the first trilogy is incredible. It's well over 80%,
wow,
which is great. And you know, Chris, we messed. So one of the challenges we had, I think, with the very first book, Lazarus Protocol, is because, like any first book, it straddles a little bit of genres. So it's a little bit of post-apocalyptic in it before it really gets heavy into sci-fi. And we really struggled initially with, how do we write the right blurb? How do we get the right cover? How do we sort of position this thing correctly? And we sort of went back and forth between positioning it as post-apocalyptic and positioning it as science fiction. And I think it's correctly positioned as science fiction. And we like to think that we're trying to start a new genre of corporate sci-fi here, because it's a very much, I mean, Chris's tagline, it's The Godfather meets The Expanse. It's 5 families set in space. But in that first book, it takes a while for them to get to space, right? So we're like, well, maybe this is like post-apocalyptic. But we were kind of fooling ourselves, I think, in hindsight, because we were overthinking it, right? We were positioning it. We were looking at it reductively rather than saying, where do we want this thing positioned? Where should it be positioned? And so we burned some energy up front with how we wrote the blurb and how we positioned the book and cover and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and some of that was by design, perhaps ineffective design on my part, because I specifically wanted to straddle genres. I wanted to start sort of post-apocalyptic and move into space opera, and move from space opera to military sci-fi, and which is, so if the first trilogy is a movement from post-apocalyptic to space opera, the second trilogy is a move from space opera to military sci-fi. And that's because I like mixing stuff up. I mean, in the second book in my series, the second series of the SynCorp Saga, I specifically said, okay, I want to write a part of this that's a haunted house. And so I read House on Haunted Hill, and I reacquainted myself with a little bit of Stephen King because I wanted to write a section that was about sort of a haunted house. Now it's a space station, but it's I used the elements from the genre, from the horror genre, to hopefully make it a creepy space station. So is that a space opera thing? Huh?
It's like Aliens. A lot of people think the movie Aliens.
Yes,
right,
exactly.
Like it's actually a horror movie.
Yep.
Yeah. Or what was and I read the novella, the George R. R. Martin novella, which is they've made a series out of it now. I forget
recent Netflix series.
Yeah, actually, I think it's Amazon Prime, maybe, or no, the Sci-Fi Channel. Anyway, I'll think of it as soon as we're off the air. But specifically, I had that in mind that he described that as it's a haunted house in space, and so I wanted to include that as a set piece in the second novel. But that ain't exactly space opera genre, that ain't exactly military sci-fi genre, but it's what I wanted to write. So again, if you're targeting a market, maybe don't follow my example.
For one thing, I've got 3 points. One is it's Night Flyers you were talking
Night
about.
Flyers, yeah.
The second point I have really is one, just to because we're cover junkies. One of the things that really struck me about the Lazarus Protocol is some of the excellent typography you have, as opposed to the cover focused as a whole. And this is one of the things I've recently learned, is how excellent typography can make a good cover become excellent.
The cover work was all Chris.
The cover work is all Chris. Okay.
No, that makes it sound like I did the work. I didn't do the work. I got in touch with the artists.
So if we can, let's focus on book one, because that's going to be the entry point to your series.
Yep.
And book one, as with any book, the first thing we're going to see is going to be the cover. So let's talk about that. Then that will move me on to the second question, which is the second part of the buy decision on this, which is going to be around the blurb. But if you can just talk about the cover briefly for us, and what went into making that, and the Lazarus Protocol.
Sure. So the cover artist actually is Adam Hall. He's done a lot of work for me before on some of my other collections and stuff. And so and David, you jump in here whenever you want. But some of one of the major decisions was, so we have in every book, I think in the second book actually, Saga's World, we have 5, but typically we have 4 perspective characters that all their storyline ends up weaving together throughout the book. And so one of the questions we had to decide was, do we want, a human being on the cover? And if we do, well, who do we choose? Because we got 4. And if you stick 4 faces on there, now it's too complicated. So do we just choose one? Are we sliding the other narratives if we do that? So we ended up going with, I think initially we didn't even have the space station on there. Imagine the cover without the space station. And I said, well, that's not sci-fi enough. I mean, I get the whole post-apocalyptic look, but it's not sci-fi enough. So, and I hesitate to say this, but I think this is really, in retrospect, this is kind of what we did. I had Adam stick a space station on it. And I don't know that it's the most effective thing on the cover, but at least you think you get the space back. So that's kind of the genesis of the cover.
Okay, and just looking at it now, I mean, it captures certain things. I mean, you've got a planet with the a dawning sun behind it, but the way that sun is portrayed is that it's almost a flame flickering over the horizon, and then you've got the space station itself, and then you've got this excellent typography as well, which really kind of neatly sort of capsules the title and whatnot, and then obviously both your names on there. So the second part of my it's probably more of a point than a question, but it may well raise some discussion. Is I love that kind of it's not a top level pitch because it's some way down the blurb, but I love the idea of if The Godfather was set in space, and then automatically as a reader coming in cold, I've like gone down the blurb until he met billionaire entrepreneur Anthony Tuck, and then I've gone down the blurb further, and then it's if The Godfather was set in space, and then I'm almost cycled back. And I have to say that's it's one of the few blurbs I've ever read that's made me cycle back through the blurb. As I say, it's more of a point than a question, but I suppose rephrasing it as a question, was that intentional?
David, why don't you, since you sort of reworked this, why don't you take that?
Yeah,
Tell us about the Godfather in space angle and the blurb and whatnot.
Yeah, so the Godfather in space angle is something that Chris has had in his head since we started this, literally since the very first meeting on this project. I mean, it has been a, you know, how he's described it at a top level pitch. So we, you know, going back to this original quandary that we placed ourselves in is it post-apocalyptic or is it science fiction? And so one of the things we said coming in is, okay, the perspective of Earth on the cover has to be from space. So that's how you know it's sci-fi, right? The Godfather and the Godfather in space idea is something that is used to set up the rest of the series, because we really want sort of that flavor of organized crime or corporate takeover set in a futuristic setting. So the idea is that you sort of run through the description of the book, and the last paragraph is really meant to sell the series rather than just the individual book. So this is the gateway to a larger series of stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the sort of two niches, as we call it on our side of the pond, as opposed to whatever the hell a niche is.
Niche.
Niches.
Niches. What's a niche? It's an itchy niche. Yeah. There you go.
Which is obviously, as you mentioned, the post-apocalyptic and the sci-fi, and then it's almost like bang, you kind of sideswiped us with the organized crime thing, which is, you know, for me an absolute added bonus, because you kind of want you want to know that the big bad is actually a big bad, don't you, somehow?
Right.
So we're moving to the halfway point. I don't know whether there's anything you want to do at the halfway point.
I should probably do an ad read. Because on my show notes there's a big sign.
Hey, that's an idea.
Ad read. All right, so let's do that. The ad read for tonight is Rules of Engagement, and here we go. In Rules of Engagement, there's some quotes in the initial blurb here. So, in Rules of Engagement, David Bruns and J.R. Olson deliver a captivating and utterly authentic portrayal of modern-day combat that compares with the best of the timeless classics by Tom Clancy, Dale Brown, and Stephen Kuntz. This one must not be missed. Mark Greaney, #1 New York Times best-selling author of Mission Critical. Here's the blurb. This is the blurb, I believe. A terrorist breach of the computer systems of the three most powerful navies is about to set them on a collision course for World War III. Rafiq Roshed is one of the most wanted men in the world, a terrorist with a virulent grudge against the West. He's disappeared into North Korea, where he quietly launches cyber sneak attacks in the service of Kim Jong-un. But now he's about to unleash his virtual masterpiece, a computer virus that once inserted into the command systems of the military, not only takes over, but also learns the art of war. First penetrating the Chinese, he has their war machine launch a series of attacks against the U.S. Pacific forces. Don Riley, head of the U.S. Cyber Command, discovers that not only have the Chinese lost control of their military, but the same virus has infected the American network. It's only a matter of time before the U.S. loses control of its own military. His secret weapon in this war is a trio of supremely talented midshipmen from the U.S. Naval Academy who uncovered the infiltration and are working to track down the elusive terrorists. But time is running out. China and Japan have lost control of their military, and the U.S. is in danger of doing the same. The weapons are hot, and the result is an ever larger real-world conflict where casualties continue to mount. The only remaining hope is to find and stop the attack at its source before time runs out.
Well, as a
in Doom, we always have to have Doom at the end. Sorry.
As an absolute fan of Dale Brown, especially, but Tom Clancy and Stephen Kuntz. Oh God, that sounds like one hell of a pitch to me. This kind of moves me on to I think we in the second half of the show, and Scott might
talk about our writing process and marketing and
process, but also I want to dive into something a little bit more into writing mentality, if I'm allowed by the Overlord Moon.
Yeah, the Moonalord is what we like to call it, or Uluru, also,
or Uluru. So, David, you've got you both have interesting backgrounds, but I just wanted to touch on David's for the moment and move on to Chris a little bit later in a moment.
His is more
interesting. Well, I wouldn't say that, but different. Both equally fascinating. How's that sound? So you're an ex-submariner officer on nuclear attack submarines, I believe, from your blurb. Now, what I'm interested on two folds is, one, you've got the military fiction side of it, side of your writing career, but also you've got the science fiction writing side of your career as well. So looking at the science fiction writing of your side of your career, can you tell us how your experience as a submariner has informed and influenced your writing? Because just to add context, one of the so in a previous life, I was posted with an ex-submariner. One of the most interesting things he said was,
I apologize in advance. Yes.
Oh, it was awful. It was awful in some ways. They're special kind of personality. But one of the really interesting things he said was that one of the reasons he joined the Navy and applied for the Submariner Corps was the closest thing Star Trek he could find in the real world. So that kind of prompts its question: how has it influenced your science fiction writing, your career?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so the interesting point about this is I entered the Naval Academy in July of '84. Hunt for Red October came out in October of '84, and Hunt for Red October was originally published by the Naval Institute Press, which is associated with the Naval Academy. So I actually met Tom Clancy when I was a midshipman. First year midshipman, and he was not famous yet. He was an insurance salesman in Maryland, and it was kind of fascinating because he never served. All of his knowledge of submarines came from talking to people and from books, but he wrote a fascinating submarine thriller that is pretty real to life, having been there. But my point is that he influenced an entire generation of submarine sailors from that book, and he never served a day in his life.
I remember some of the early reviews, they had falsely said that he had served as a submariner.
Right. I mean, no, he when I met him, if you picture someone, who sells insurance, that's what he would. I mean, that's who you would picture. He was, sort of schlumpy. He didn't really have very much of a authorial presence at that point. He sort of murmured a lot and said, I wrote this book, and it's about submarines, and we're all sitting there like, this dude was not a Navy officer. How did he write a book about submarines? And I I had a copy and I read it and I was like, holy crap! If this is what it's really like, I want in. But to your point, I mean, I think that there's a sense of adventure that I think permeates both of those genres, and that's really what I go for. Is that the stakes are high. Technology is a critical role in both types of books, and you want a sense of adventure that takes you to new places and has you do new things, like a Star Trek, right? Which, I mean, Star Trek could be on, a boat. It could be on, an army unit, or it could be in space. It's about adventure. It's about a team of people working together, and it's about doing new things. And that's the thread that I think goes through both of those genres for me personally.
And how do you think? So one of the key things that I got from talking to my housemate at that point was that bizarrely enough, he was one of the most weird people to live with, but also he's the most considerate as well. And I could quite see why, when he had like a 2 meter by 1 meter, whatever space that was his own personal. Because I appreciate that in a submarine, you don't see daylight for 3 months or more. Right. The only people you see are the same people who are on your watch, or the same people that are in your crew for a long period of time. Do you think that gives you more of well, it's obvious it gives you more of an insight. That's a silly question. But do you feel you can communicate that well? And do you think that adds to your writing?
Yeah, I mean, so the writing bug for me came long before I was in submarines. It was sort of the life experience that I wanted out of it. And sort of that, I mean, the thought of being in a steel tube, hundreds of feet under the water, off the northern coast of Russia in the middle of winter, I thought was really cool when I was 24. And it was really cool.
As long as everything works, it's great.
Exactly, and when things don't work, it can get pretty hairy. Because the one thing I think the submariners do probably better than any other service is, you're on your own. You can't call for repair parts. You can't, if something breaks, you got to fix it. And because nobody comes off station. So, I've seen people take leather belts and fix things. I've seen people come up with workarounds on stuff that, you just look at it and say, how did he think of this? Because, I mean, it's sort of what they do. You become very, I was going to say ingenuitive, but that's not even a word.
MacGyver. You MacGyver that stuff.
Right.
Fancy fix it.
Thank you.
One of the, and again, I hate to sort of add a substitute interviewer in here, but one of the things I remember him saying was that you get a real sense of that the submarines are much larger than they perhaps are in reality in Hunt for Red October and Crimson Tide, and actually they're much more claustrophobic and tight than perhaps is really portrayed. Is there any kind of media that you kind of think that or what, in your opinion, most accurately represents life on a submarine? It doesn't necessarily have to be a submarine question. A submarine that is your point. Right. Something that represents that kind of really kind of tight environment.
They're much larger than they appear to be when you see them surface, because 2/3 of the submarine is beneath water. But you also got to recognize that when you see the full length of a submarine, the back 2/3, nobody lives there because that's the engine room. It's the front third where people live. And so your average crew is going to be 120 people. And when you think of 120 people living in, a space, I don't know, it's probably a 30-foot or 40-foot cylinder, maybe, I don't know, 100 feet long or something like that.
Sounds pretty cool.
It's pretty cramped. I mean, they make use of every single bit of space. For example, when we would go on deployment in the berthing areas where you probably have 50 or 60 people, living 3 bunks up. You know, when you leave port, you turn out lights in the berthing area, and you know, because there's watch sections all the time, so somebody's always sleeping. You reline the floors with cans, with big cans of whatever, peaches, chili, whatever, tomato sauce. So you would eat your way through all these cans over the course of several months of deployment because there's no other place to put food.
Nice.
So you know, you do things like that. It's just how you live because that's what you got, right?
That's not how I pictured living on a submarine. Is a lot of your canned goods there underneath in the berthing area.
Yeah.
I think that,
Let's go.
for me, that's absolutely fascinating.
Oh yeah, it's totally
but I think we need to bring Paul Chris back into the conversation.
Let's do that. Let's talk.
What?
Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, what? No, I was just waking up. Sorry.
We talked about the process and to go back to your guys' your co-authored series of this the SynCorp Saga, and we talked a little bit about the collaboration process, but like so. Maybe some of the mechanics would be interesting. Like, do you guys use any specific tools or technology, or you know, how do you kick that off? How does that work?
Well, as far as the technology goes, I mean, I just write in Word. I know David uses what is it?
Scrivener. Scrivener.
Scrivener. Yeah. So as far as technology goes, I mean, it's pretty simple. I just use Word, and I rely on Polgara Studios, who is in Australia, to format it for me for Amazon.
Excellent. What about like somebody? I mean, so a lot of things we talk about normally are like outlining versus pantsing, and then like so I'm in several different collaborations. Some of them like I have a collaborator that sends me detailed outlines. I have some that we just talk about the story concept, and then I write some, and he does some stuff. And how do you two do it?
Well, it's a long story. What we learned was we should write independently and let the other guy give us some beta reader feedback, and then incorporate that as we see fit as the primary author. We originally wrote a duology for Nick Webb's Legacy Fleet Kindle World. David wrote a novel called Invincible, and I wrote a follow-up. Well, it's sort of the next novel in the storyline called Avenger. He had a primary character, a captain named Addison Halsey, and then I sort of put her in the background and put my captain named Samantha Avery up front. And that worked really well, and we should have stuck with that.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Chris. Can I just ask that you just kind of sneak the microphone a little bit closer?
Sure.
Thank you.
Is that better?
I think you're probably actually talking. I think you're actually as your computer mic's picking up. I'm not sure your headset's.
Oh,
I can hear you, but so if you just sit closer to the computer,
sure. That could very well be. Okay. So anyway.
There you go.
Oh,
so
perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. See the whole technology thing. So when we started SynCorp, we started something different where we tried to do like he would do a draft and send it to me, and I would do some rewrites on it and stuff and send it back to him, and that just didn't work well because we both have a very independent way in which we approach. We have different writing styles, but we also have different writing approaches. He likes to write from front to the end of the novel and then go back to the beginning and write it over again, and go back to the beginning and write it over again. And I'm much more iterative about writing a little bit of a chapter and rewriting and then finishing the chapter. And then writing it. So anyway, we just had different styles that we learned by the end of the first trilogy were too different to sustain that model. And so in the second trilogy, I'm sort of writing it with his input and getting his beta read feedback and trying to make them. For example, in this third book in the second series, I said in the first 10 chapters, he said, okay, you can't have this character in the same space in 2 different chapters. You need to put this in 1 chapter. And I'm just trying to write to the deadline, right? And I'm like, man, you're killing me. You're basically cutting out a chapter's worth of my effort here. But he's right. I mean, it just to move the story along, you need to kind of keep the click going. So anyway, I'll let David sort of speak to his side of it, but that's kind of what we learned is we just have different styles, and we have to complement one another and give one another space enough to do our own thing.
And clearly it works because from what I see, you've got one of the strongest consistent partnerships that works. And yeah, I think you're being slightly derogatory if I'm being a little directive in sort of like sort of saying, well, you know, he does his thing, I do mine. But whatever you two are doing collectively is working. Is that adding strength to what you're doing, or not? I don't know. It's a poorly phrased question, but do with it what you will.
David, you want to take that?
Yeah. So I having done 2 long-term collaborations now, and Scott, maybe you can weigh in on this too. I think when you enter a collaboration, you enter a relationship, and it is, you don't really, what you think you're bringing to the party and what you're actually bringing to the party are not necessarily the same thing, not through any fault of self-awareness. I mean, I think it's on both sides. It's through a process of you figure out what's the right way we work together. So the way I work with Chris is very different than the way I work with JR. For example, JR is not really a writer in the traditional sense. JR has a 21-year career naval intel officer, and he retired a few years ago. He still teaches in the same space, in naval intelligence and weapons of mass destruction, in counterintelligence type topics. So he stays very current, right? So he does a lot of the front end work. He does a lot of the research. He does a lot of the outlining, and I do a lot of the heavy lifting on the writing.
Okay, hang on. I have to interrupt David for just a second. Tell them how long the outline for Rules of Engagement was when he handed it to you to write from.
Yeah.
Wait.
We should have a poll so you can guess.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say before you say. Yeah.
So it was like 200 pages. Now it had pictures and links and all kinds of stuff in it. But I mean, this is the kind of research front load I get, right? So now Chris and I work very differently. The reason why is because Chris is a writer. Chris and Chris was kind of recounting some of the iterations we went through on the first couple of books, and part of the reason was by the time we got to sort of into book 2, I'm like, dude, you really want to write your own book, so you should use that energy on a new novel, not on rewriting what I gave you. Not that, I mean, and I'm trying to phrase it right, and it's not really coming across. When we first got together,
it's almost like it's not you, it's me.
So we got together because Chris has an editing background. So when we first got together, we said, this is going to be great. I'll do the first draft, you edit it, and we'll be able to do stuff fast.
Exactly.
And what we ended up doing was I gave him a first draft, a real first draft. So Chris and I had worked together before, but the only thing he had seen of mine was like a finished draft, which is pretty good. A first draft ain't very good. And I sent him the first draft, and he called me up. He says, "What the hell is this? This is terrible." I said,
I didn't say it was terrible.
Okay. He didn't say it was terrible. That's true. I'm telling you what I heard, and he didn't say that.
You're like, he probably should have said that, but he didn't because he was nice.
Scott, did you have like a domestic violence process you have to follow? Because I'm kind of seeing that I might have
intervention.
So look, a draft is not a beautiful piece of art. It is a work in progress. And in hindsight, what I should have done is I should have kept it and worked it a few times before I sent it over. And he says, "Well, yeah." He says, "Look, I need to do a lot of work on that." I said, "Well, do some work on it." And then I got it back. I'm like, "But that's not really what I meant in this part here."
Yeah.
So yeah, you go through this sort of give and take thing. I mean, now we work in very much more of a advisory role, I guess is how you'd put it, Chris. Or,
yeah, that's right. That's what I mean. Like we each write our own. Like I think we got through the first 2 books were the really tough. Like, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? And by the time we get to the 3rd book, I gave him an outline for what I thought it could be. And we even, my wife and I even traveled up and spent, 4 or 5 days with David and his wife. And David and I went to the library and whiteboarded, some of the stuff in the outline and all that kind of thing. And then I just gave him the outline, and he I don't know, 60 or 70% of the spirit of it was probably there in the novel. And then he reworked it, made it his own, and, changed it the way you want to change it. And then when I got the draft from him, I gave him my feedback on the draft. He refined the draft. We got it edited, and it was done. Yeah. So that's the way we've treated the second series. Is I'll draft, either the whole thing or a certain number of chapters, or whatever, turn it over to him, and he'll give me his feedback, and then I'll incorporate his feedback, or sometimes I won't, because I'll override his suggestion. But at least I have it, and I think about it, and I consider it, and that's not what, like he said, that's not what I wanted to do here. Yeah. So again, we trust each other's judgment, and we respect each other's ability enough to sort of check it at the door, and say, okay, I'm going to consider seriously what he said. And that's kind of what we do now.
Yeah. So it's almost like a developmental editor plus level, where you're kind of working between each other.
That's a really important takeaway, that you have to decide who's going to make the final say, or that it's okay for people to change your stuff, like they say, kill your darlings. It's hard to let somebody else kill your darlings in your story.
I think this very important, or what I'm getting from this discussion is, it's very important to check your ego at the door. And when someone else calls you on something, that you've got to consider it strongly. And yes, you still might say no, because ultimately it's your that's your prerogative, but
it's also a lot about expectations too, because I've had edits where, like, one book, I had a book that took me 40 days to write, and it took me 4 months to handle the edits that got sent back to me. And then let's not bring that up, Scott. No,
that's not that was as traumatic for
that was hard on my friend
and I as it was for you.
That was actually long before I met you guys. But I've had books where I expected, like with one of my collaborators, I expect to have heavy changes I need to make, and then I had somewhere like an edit might take an afternoon. Well, then I got one of the books back, and it was massive rewrites required, and I wasn't prepared for it. So I went in there going, I'm going to bang this out in a couple of days and send it back, and we're off to the races. And when I got how much work I had to do with it, it was just devastating. I, of course, whine and bitch to Raph and Josh and things. So, but I think expectations and going into it, when you learn what you expect from each other and what's cool.
But right. I think you also have to give room for that collaboration to grow. So like when Chris and I first started working together, it made perfect sense for us to say, I'll do the first draft, you do the edit. I mean, because that's how, it was
sounds like a great idea. I mean, it sounds like this is perfect. It's an assembly line.
Well, and that's how we had worked together before. David had a few short stories in some of my collections and stuff. And, I was the editor on the collections, and that's how it worked,
Yeah. And so, I mean, that iteration made perfect sense, but in the practice of writing a full novel and the generation of the novel and all the revisions, it didn't make sense. But we wouldn't have known that until you go do it, right?
Go try it. So what would your advice be for people that are thinking about collaborating?
Yeah, I mean, look, collaborations, you got to give it time. I'm convinced it takes a year for a collaboration to grow into what it's going to be on a stable basis. I mean, when JR and I first started working together, we did the same thing. We tried, I write a chapter, you write a chapter. That didn't work. We tried other stuff, and it just, you got to try things, rational things, until you find the formula that works for those two people. Because again, I think what you find is that what you think you're bringing to that collaboration and what you think your strengths and weaknesses are complementary with that other person are not all. I think you're going to be surprised about how the blend works out in the end. I think Chris and I are very happy with the final product. But I mean, collaboration is a contact sport. You're going to cruise along the way.
And think of it.
No plan survives contact with the enemy, does it?
Right.
In this case, the enemy is your collaborator.
So think of it this way. Think of it this way, and this is going to be funny, but think of it this way: it's like getting married and then dating for a year and figuring each other out instead of the other way around. When you start a partnership, boom, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, going back to I think Ralph's question about plotting and pantsing. So I like to have an outline because I like to know when I start chapter 10, this is what's supposed to happen. But almost every time I'll get into chapter 10 and I'm like, well, what if this happened? And I go off in a different direction, which then changes chapter 11. But I always have a marking post, a post at the beginning. So I'm never sitting there looking at the page saying, what am I going to write? So I always have, I kind of use the outline as like a writing prompt.
Yep.
And I have a vector,
perfect.
but the vector is not necessarily, it's a wide vector. It's not a tight.
Yeah, and I'm the same way. I like to do like, let's say I have a 2,500 word chapter. I might have 3 or 4 scenes in it. Scene 1, 500 words. This is what's going on. This is the atmosphere. This is what's motivating character. Scene 2, blah, 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 blah. And then I let the characters develop actually what happens in the scenes. And scene 1 might change to scene 2. I might bump scene 3 to the next chapter because scene 2 blew up. But I like to have that prompt, as David called it, because otherwise I'm just staring at a cursor blinking at me and it terrifies me. So I need something.
Sorry, can I just pause you guys there? So in the SynCorp Saga, the 6 books, you've mentioned that you've got four characters, 4 point of views. Would that be?
Yeah, and they rotate.
Yeah,
they rotate, like 3 that carry through each novel, and then a new one shows up, and then we drop another one, and a new one shows up. So it's not the same 4 characters, just to be clear.
Okay, fine. Does one of the okay, phrasing it. Does do you gift each other ownership of a point of view? I.e., someone has primacy over Joe Bloggs over Jane Smith or whatever, or how does that work? Because so to cycle this back to sort of making the question more directed, for example, in the Expanse Saga, I know that the 2 authors in the Expanse Saga, they said, right, you're having that character and I'm having that character, and this is the general direction of the story. How do you guys run those 4 characters?
Well, since we don't actually trade off in the books, he writes his characters, I write my characters. My second series is set about 30 years later than the first. So some of his characters show up in my books. And in fact, he has a character and the 3rd book as a perspective character that I have picked up in my 3rd book. She becomes a perspective character later on. If by gift you mean he's already laid the groundwork for that character, absolutely. But we don't really trade off characters in one novel because we're not writing together per se anymore. We're writing as consultants.
Right. And so like with the Expanse, I know Daniel Abraham, I think one of them, and I forget which one, only wrote the dialogue for Joe Miller. And that was like his thing. And the other one had something else. So we don't do it that way. But so, for example, we will talk about how a character is getting launched. So there's a very particular character that carries over from the end of the trilogy that I was prime on to the beginning, and actually carries through all the books. Chris is prime on. He's like, okay, these are the things that have to happen because I need them, right? He has to do this. He's going to shoot this person, but it doesn't work. He has this phobia about this, so we will seed things. And so, for example, once I graduate a character to him, I mean, he does, it's then his thing, right? So, I mean, again, we talk about, what that character will or won't do, but if you're prime on that novel, those decisions are yours. We don't go back and second guess the other guy about what he did. I mean, you basically lay the groundwork and you say, this is what I need. And he says, okay. And he works it in, right?
Yeah. Although
sorry, Chris, that's led to a fascinating set of questions for me, but I am absolutely minded that we've reached the end of the hour of the show. So what I propose is that I'll ask the next question, which Scott's going to have a wry smile over, and then we sort of like have a short bonus time discussion about that. Okay, I'm going to direct it towards Chris. and then I'm sure Scott will direct the same question towards David. Chris, do you have a favorite secondary character, not one of your main ones, and tell us why?
Well, gosh, that is a tough question, man. Secondary character. Actually, one of the lead narrative characters, but he's not a perspective character, is the Godfather figure in my trilogy, and he graduates to that status in David's trilogy. His name is Tony Talk, and he's an interesting combination. I mean, if you think of the Marlon Brando character, Vito Corleone, he wasn't a heartless bastard, but he did what was necessary for his family business, right? And Tony has kind of inherited that same kind of mantle. So one of the things I like about writing character is that I hate white hats and black hats. Again, not a marketing strategy. I prefer gray characters because I think they're more human and they're more interesting, and they make stupid mistakes, and they make great, strides towards heroism when they're not necessarily heroes. And anyway, I like characters that are interesting. I don't like black hats and white hats. So Tony is one of those kinds of characters. He is not a nice guy by the end of David's trilogy. And he's not a particularly nice guy in my trilogy either. But he's an interesting guy. I had one reader tell me that she actually liked him as a character, and I was like, really? Because he's kind of a jerk. But she, and that's great. I'm glad that she can find something in him to like. That's the grayness that I like to explore.
So I wonder, Chris, if hypothetically speaking, if we were to we say that as a royal we, i.e. you guys, were to rewrite the story as Tony as the lead point of view, would he be the hero in his own story?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, this is the Walking Dead question with Negan, right? If it were Negan's story and not Rick Grimes' story, maybe Negan would be the hero and Rick would be the villain if everybody knows those characters. So yeah, exactly. Everybody's the hero of their own story, right?
Oh God, it was such a loaded question.
Thanks, by the way. I didn't even need a glove for that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Scott, have you got any questions for David?
I was going to say, do you have any secondary characters that just kind of pop out?
So yeah,
you can't choose Tony.
Oh, sure, he had like 5 minutes to think of it. Sure.
So Tony is a consistent secondary character throughout the first trilogy, who becomes a dominant character in the second trilogy. So I don't reuse the same character. There is a young Chinese woman who has a lover, and she just keeps coming back to her again and again, and she keeps treating Lily like crap, and Lily keeps taking it because it's true love. And so I would say my favorite secondary character is Lily. Excellent. Who was introduced in the very first book, and goes on until something happens to Lily, and we're not going to talk about that here.
No spoilers.
No. You can give the spoiler, but we've got to give the spoiler warning after.
That's tradition. That's a show tradition.
Spoiler tradition.
Warning. Exactly. We ask that question a lot because it generally writers are always sometimes surprised that, oh yeah, I really do like that secondary character.
Yeah.
It's almost always something that happens in the writing process. You have these characters, your concept of the story is this, but then these other things happen. These other people.
Right, exactly.
Well, I think this is your guys' interview, but rather than mine. But one of the things is like the key characters have to drive your plot. But your second characters can sometimes be an indulgent.
They can do whatever they want. They can,
they can be someone you like or you dislike, or whatever. But
they say the things that you can't say in real life a lot of times.
One of my really quickly, I know we're kind of short of time. One of my prototypes for the question that you're asking, Ralph, is the character of Dracula. who is hardly in the novel at all. He's sort of in the beginning, and he's very much present towards the end, but he's basically an atmosphere for most of the novel, Stoker's novel. And so I have a character like that named Cassandra in my second series, where you see snippets of her mainly on video. But she's more of an atmospheric character. Tony is kind of like that too. Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. So I kind of look to Bram Stoker a little bit on that, because I really think he did an effective job making a novel about a character that hardly shows up in it.
Yeah. That is
that's a brilliant answer.
Yeah, that was an act of genius in.
Thanks. I thought it was a pretty good answer myself.
Yeah. Well,
you meant Stoker.
In Cassandra, Bram Stoker, and whoever wrote The Usual Suspects as well, because the guys associating discovering who he was, and it's like anyway. I digress.
So let's jump out and let's talk about where we can find your books or find more about each of you, and then we'll roll on out and have a post show that'll be a blast.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, we can swear lots.
Hey, you bet.
David, you better talk about your rules of engagement, man, or
sure,
you're going to be mad.
So you can find everything you want to find about me and my books on my website, which is my name, David Bruns, B-R-U-N-S. Bruns rhymes with buns with an R in it.
Do you squat? Because you've got to squat with a name like that.
Bruns' buns.
That's right. So the new book, Rules of Engagement, which launches tomorrow. The SynCorp Saga, all those books are there. You can find them all either on the homepage or on the tabs in the menu.
And having looked at the blurb, or listened to the blurb that Scott said, I'm going to be buying that because it sounds brilliant, and a little bit of a keystroke interest is that Ralph is my pseudonym and the villain is named after my real name. So
you got Tuckerized and you didn't even know it.
It's like suddenly like Darth Vader giving an interview and then going, "Hey guys."
My name's Darth.
So it is an excellent book. I read it when it was called War.exe, which, by the way, I think is a better title. That's not on David. That's on the publisher. But it was a terrific book, and it was the third book in the series. Actually, the first two books are indie published. I think he said that earlier. So it's really well developed characters that he and JR have had time to explore, and it's just a really, really fascinating book. And it was so funny back when the tensions when Trump was talking to Kim Jong-un, and we were like, "Man, you got to get this book out. If we have peace with North Korea, man, you've missed your window. You've missed your window."
Go for it.
So, yay.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great book. You can find my... I'm sorry, Ralph. I didn't mean to cut you off. Just really quickly, you can find my stuff at chrispourteau.com. I'll spell the last name for you. It's POURTEAU.com. You can find the SynCorp stuff and my other novels there. And I think that's it.
Brilliant stuff. I'll speak on behalf of Scott and I and Keystroke Medium. It's been absolutely fantastic to have both of you on board for tonight. And for the audience, I'm sorry you've had to slum it with Scott and I. And Josh hasn't been here like doing all of his charismatic magic. But
Josh is watching this right now, shaking his head. Come on.
Yeah.
Never again. What have you done to Keystroke Medium, you bastards? But it's been fantastic, and I think we've learned a lot about your collaborative techniques. Especially fascinated to hear about sort of the influence of the Submariner side of things for you, David. And there were one of the questions I wanted to ask, but I think I will hand it over to Scott for the wrap up.
The wrap up, thank everybody for hanging out with us. Make sure everybody goes and leave some comments below. Be sure to give us a thumbs up. You can give us a thumbs up if you can figure out what a thumbs up is, but I think I probably meant to say thumbs up on the episode. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you get notified when we get new episodes. Make sure to share these episodes around. It's good for our guests. It's good for the show, and it's the right thing to do. We always want to do the right thing. So for Ralph Kern, I'm Scott Moon. We've been live with Chris Pourteau and David Bruns. Be sure to come back next week as we talk about reading, writing, and everything in between right here at Keystroke Medium.
Bye, guys.